When I turned 65, I thought I had it all figured out. I had my family, my home, and my life seemed to be on track. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on my birthday. The table was set, the candles were lit, and I had cooked all their favorite dishes. I was expecting my family to walk through the door, ready to celebrate. I checked the clock and then I checked it again. The hours passed and no one showed up. The food was getting cold, and the candles were melting down to nothing. My heart sank with every passing minute. I sent a quick text to my son, hoping maybe they were just running late. No response. I checked my phone again, but nothing. It wasn't like them to forget. I didn't want to believe it. The silence in my house was suffocating. I walked over to the window and stared out, half expecting someone to walk up the driveway. Nothing. I grabbed the phone once more, hoping that maybe I had missed a message. Still nothing. Then just as I thought I might finally lose it, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Facebook. I opened it without thinking. The first thing I saw was a photo of my daughter-in-law, smiling brightly, holding a drink with the ocean in the background. Beneath the picture a caption read, "Living our best life on a cruise." And in the background there they all were. My son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, all of them on a cruise. My stomach twisted as I read the comments of friends and family who were all praising the trip. My hands trembled as I stared at the picture. How could they do this to me? I had been waiting all day for them to show up. All the effort, the food, the decorations, it felt pointless now. I felt like I had been thrown away like an afterthought, a piece of furniture no longer needed. They didn't even have the decency to call and cancel. My heart pounded in my chest as I put the phone down. Was this really happening? Were they so comfortable with leaving me behind that they didn't even think to show up? I glanced at the clock again, but the reality of it all hadn't sunk in yet. I couldn't understand why they would do this. My son had always been close, always promised me that no matter what, we would be together as a family. But now I was sitting here alone, staring at a table set for 8, and wondering what had gone wrong. I sat there for a while, my mind racing. I wanted to pick up the phone and call them, to scream, to demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the humiliation. Maybe it was the disbelief. It didn't feel real. I walked around the house, looking at the photos on the walls, the framed pictures of family vacations, birthdays and holidays. All the memories of times when we were happy together, when we had shared so much. I found myself wondering if I had been blind to something all these years. Was I always just a prop in their lives, there to make everything look nice, to fill in the gaps? I sat back down at the table and stared at the cake untouched. The candles had long since burned out, but I didn't feel like blowing them out. I didn't want to erase the last bit of hope I had left. I still kept waiting, as if someone would walk in through the door, apologize, and say it was all a mistake. But the door never opened. As the night wore on, I knew I had to accept the truth. I was alone. Completely alone. It wasn't just the party that had been forgotten, it was me. I was the one who had been forgotten. And I couldn't understand why. I thought about all the times I had been there for them, all the sacrifices, all the love I had given. But none of that seemed to matter. I wasn't even worth a phone call. I thought back to when my husband was alive. He used to be the glue that held us all together. Now that he was gone, it seemed like the family was falling apart. My son hadn't even called. He hadn't even bothered to tell me he was leaving for a vacation with his wife and kids. He didn't even care enough to include me. It was like I never even existed. I sat there, lost in my thoughts, and then it hit me. This wasn't just about a missed birthday party. This wasn't just about a forgotten day. It was about something deeper. Something that had been building up for years, and I had been too blind to see it. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and walked to the window. I looked outside at the quiet street, the empty driveway. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just a one-time thing. No, this was part of a pattern. A pattern that I had been too naive to notice. But now I saw it for what it was. And I wasn't going to sit idly by anymore. I couldn't. Not when I had been treated like this. Not when my own flesh and blood had so casually cast me aside. The truth had come crashing down, and I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. I wasn't going to be their doormat anymore. I wasn't going to let them use me, ignore me, and make me feel invisible. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not anymore. The silence in my house was deafening. As the clock ticked away and the party decorations sat untouched, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the emptiness in the room. The table I had so carefully set, the food I had spent hours preparing, all of it felt like a cruel joke now. I thought about calling my son again, but something told me that the conversation would be futile. I had already tried reaching out, and it was clear that they had no intention of coming. It was as if they had all planned this. I couldn't believe it. The family I had spent my entire life loving and caring for had left me in this cold, lifeless house. And for what? Why? It didn't make sense. As I sat there staring at the untouched cake, the words from that last message flashed in my mind, living our best life on a cruise. The irony hit me hard. They were out enjoying themselves while I was left behind, abandoned on my 65th birthday, the day I had looked forward to for weeks. I wanted to scream to confront them, but what was the point? The reality had already set in. I had been forgotten. I had been discarded. The question that kept echoing in my mind was, why? I couldn't stop thinking about it. My son, my only child, had promised me that we would always be close. Yet here I was sitting in an empty room, surrounded by memories of a time when things were different. I thought back to the years I had spent raising him, all the sacrifices, all the late nights, and the countless moments where I had put his needs above my own. And now this, it hurt more than I ever thought it would. I had spent years building a family, and now it felt like I was nothing more than an afterthought. I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, but they kept creeping back in one after the other. I tried to focus on something, anything to take my mind off the situation. But there was no escaping the truth. My family didn't care. They didn't care enough to even show up for me on my birthday. I stood up from the table and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the houses across the street were just as still as mine. It was hard to wrap my mind around it. How had it all come to this? How had I become so invisible to the people who should have cared for me the most? I spent the next few hours pacing around the house, the silence growing louder with each step I took. I kept replaying the events of the day in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was just a mistake, I told myself. Maybe they forgot, or maybe something came up. But deep down I knew better. I had been left behind, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth was too clear to deny. I wasn't just forgotten. I was being pushed aside. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the table, but every action felt hollow. The empty chairs around me served as a painful reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't stop the tears from welling up in my eyes. I had spent so much time trying to be there for them, trying to make sure they had everything they needed. And now it felt like none of that mattered. I took a deep breath and wiped my eyes. There was no point in crying over something I couldn't change. I had to face the reality that my family had moved on without me. They no longer needed me. I stood in the kitchen for a moment trying to steady myself. I could feel the anger rising inside me. How could they do this? How could they leave me here alone on my birthday? I had always tried to be the best mother, the best grandmother. I had always put them first, even when it meant sacrificing my own happiness. And this was how they repaid me? I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the messages. I was looking for something, anything that might explain what had happened. But all I found were the same old empty promises. No one had reached out to me, not even to explain why they couldn't come. They didn't even care enough to send a message. My hands shook as I put the phone down. The anger was starting to consume me, but there was no one to direct it at. No one to confront. I had been abandoned, and it seemed like no one even cared. I walked back into the living room and sat down, trying to gather my thoughts. The silence in the house was suffocating, and the emptiness felt more overwhelming with every passing second. I thought about calling Ruth, my sister. Maybe she could offer some comfort, some kind of explanation. But even as I reached for my phone, I knew it wouldn't change anything. The truth was already clear. My family had chosen to leave me behind. They had made their decision, and now I had to live with it. I wasn't sure what to do next. The anger still burned inside me, but I didn't know how to channel it. I didn't know how to fix this. The family I had built was gone, and I was left to pick up the pieces. I didn't know if I would ever find the answers I was looking for, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to find a way to move forward to reclaim my life. The first step was accepting the truth. I was no longer part of their lives and I couldn't change that. But what I could do was change how I moved forward. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I had to find a way to take control again. The anger would have to fuel my strength, not my bitterness. It was time to stand up for myself, even if it meant standing alone. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to process everything that had happened. The silence in my house was deafening, and I found myself walking through rooms that once felt so full of life, now cold and empty. I had always thought that family was supposed to be the one thing that never let you down. But now I was left wondering if I had been wrong all along. I couldn't help but replay the events in my mind over and over again. Why hadn't they come? I had spent so much time preparing for that day, hoping to make it special for all of us. But in the end it was just me. Alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an accident. There was something more going on here, something deeper. It wasn't just about the birthday party. It was about how they had treated me for years. I had been so focused on being the perfect mother and grandmother that I hadn't noticed the subtle shifts in their behavior. The way they had begun to avoid me, the way my son's visits had become less frequent. I had brushed it off as them being busy with their own lives, but now it was clear that it was more than that. They had been pushing me out little by little without me even realizing it. My heart ached as I thought about all the times I had been there for them, all the sacrifices I had made. When my husband passed away, I had done everything I could to hold our family together. I had been strong for them even when I was falling apart inside. But now it seemed like none of that mattered. They had moved on without me. I wasn't sure how to feel anymore. Part of me was angry, furious even at how they had treated me. But another part of me felt deeply betrayed. These were the people I had loved, the people I had raised, and now they had left me behind as if I was nothing. The thought of it made my stomach turn. But as the days passed, I began to realize that I couldn't keep dwelling on it. I couldn't keep waiting for them to come back and fix things. I had to take control of my own life. I had to stop being the victim in my own story. And so I decided to make a change. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew there would be challenges ahead, but I was ready to take the first step. I began by reaching out to old friends, people I hadn't spoken to in years. People who had always been there for me, even when my family wasn't. It felt good to reconnect, to remind myself that I wasn't completely alone. I started going out more, doing things I enjoyed, things that had always brought me happiness before my life had been consumed by family obligations. I even took a weekend trip to the coast, something I hadn't done in ages. The fresh air and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was breathing again. But even as I took these steps toward healing, I knew the truth still lingered. My family had made their choice, and no matter how much I tried to move forward, that truth was hard to ignore. The pain of their betrayal was still there, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. It wasn't something I could just forget, but I was learning to live with it, to accept that some things were beyond my control. I had to find a way to live my life on my own terms, without waiting for their approval or their love. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been living for them, not for myself. I had spent so many years trying to make them happy, trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect grandmother, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had forgotten what it meant to take care of myself, to do the things that made me feel alive. It was time to change that. As I sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset, I thought about what I wanted for the future. I had no idea what it would look like yet. But I knew one thing. I was no longer going to let my family define me. I was going to create my own story, one that didn't revolve around them. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things could get better. Maybe I could start over even at 65. But I knew it wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time and it would take work. But I was ready for it. I didn't need their approval to be happy. I could find my own happiness on my own. The next few months weren't easy. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, when I missed the days when my family was all I had. But there were also moments of joy, moments where I felt truly alive again. I was rediscovering myself piece by piece. And with each passing day, I was getting stronger. I knew there would be bumps along the way. But I also knew that I was no longer the woman who had been left behind. I was someone else now. Someone who had found her voice, her strength, and her independence. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, but it was the life I was going to make. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. I spent the next few days in a strange kind of numbness, as if the world around me was moving but I was standing still. Every time I passed the dining room, I saw the empty chairs, the table that had been set for 8, now barren and untouched. It reminded me of everything that had gone wrong. The anger had faded into something darker, sadness. But even sadness after a while becomes too heavy to carry. I had spent days wallowing in my own hurt, trying to make sense of the wreckage my family had left behind. I spent hours looking at old photos, memories of a time when everything seemed right. When my son was small, when my husband was still alive, when we had shared so many laughs and moments of happiness. The life we had built together seemed so distant now, almost as if it belonged to someone else. But I couldn't keep looking back. I had to face forward. I needed to move on. So I began to take small steps toward creating a life for myself again. It wasn't easy though. The loneliness still crept in. The nights were the hardest. I would sit in my chair, the TV playing quietly in the background, and I would feel the emptiness of the house press down on me. There was no one to share a cup of coffee with in the morning, no one to talk to in the evening. The silence was almost suffocating at times. But then there were moments when the silence wasn't so bad. When I could sit with my own thoughts, think about what I had done, what I had accomplished. I had raised a son, had a family, had given everything I had to them. But I had never taken the time to think about what I wanted, what I needed. For the first time in years, I started asking myself those questions. What do I want for myself now? What kind of life do I want to create for the years ahead? I couldn't keep living in the shadow of the family I had lost. I had to rebuild, not just for them but for me. I started doing things that made me happy. Little things like taking walks around the neighborhood, picking up a book I had put down years ago, going out to lunch with a friend I hadn't seen in a long time. I was finding my way again, one small step at a time. The more I focused on myself, the more I began to realize just how much I had sacrificed over the years. It wasn't just the missed moments with my family, the times when I had been left out of their plans. It was the years of putting their needs before my own, of always being the one who held everything together, even when I was falling apart inside. And I had let it go on for too long. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had lost sight of who I was. I had been so consumed with trying to keep everyone else happy that I had forgotten what it meant to take care of myself. And that's what I had to change. I couldn't go on like this, waiting for people who didn't care about me, for people who had shown me over and over again that I wasn't important to them. I couldn't keep being the person they called on only when it was convenient for them. It was time to stop being the doormat. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. Slowly I began to make more changes. I took a trip to the coast, something I had always wanted to do but never had the chance. It was a small thing but it felt like a victory. I had done it for myself, not for anyone else. And it felt good. I stayed in a small cabin by the water, spending my days exploring the beach, reading, and simply being alone with my thoughts. It was the most peaceful I had felt in months. There I began to understand something important. The world hadn't ended because my family had walked out on me. In fact, it was starting to feel like I was reclaiming parts of myself that I had buried for so long. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning to live again. But the realization came with its own weight. I couldn't just turn a blind eye to the reality of what had happened. My family had made their choice. And I had to accept that. I couldn't keep hoping they would change. I couldn't keep waiting for an apology that would never come. But I wasn't giving up on myself. I had to keep moving forward, even if that meant doing it alone. I returned from the trip with a renewed sense of purpose. I was determined to keep rebuilding my life brick by brick. I started volunteering at the local community center, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. Helping others made me feel useful again. And it brought a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't felt in years. I was starting to find new meaning in my life, and it was liberating. But the pain didn't disappear overnight. There were still days when I missed my family, when I longed for the days when we had been close. There were still nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming. But those moments were fewer and farther between. The more I focused on myself, the less I felt their absence. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I was stronger than I had given myself credit for. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was just in a new chapter of my life. And while it might not be the life I had imagined, it was the life I was going to create. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. I had been moving forward piece by piece with the life I was starting to rebuild. Yet, there were moments when the past crept back in, and I found myself alone with the memories of what had been. It was like trying to walk with a shadow constantly at your heels, no matter how far you walked ahead. The loneliness was different now, though less suffocating. It wasn't the overwhelming emptiness I had felt before, but more like a quiet reminder of what I had lost. Some days I would sit by the window looking out at the changing seasons. The trees outside were just beginning to bud, and I could see the hints of spring in the air. It was hard not to think about how much time had passed, how many birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays had come and gone without a second thought from my family. But I was beginning to find peace in the quiet. I started to understand that my healing didn't depend on them. It was something I had to do for myself regardless of what they did or didn't do. I didn't know when it had happened, but something had shifted in me. I wasn't the same woman who had sat alone at the dining table, waiting for a family that would never come. I had found something new inside me, strength. It wasn't a loud, defiant kind of strength, but a quiet one. It was in the way I had learned to accept the things I couldn't change. It was in the small steps I took every day to heal. And it was in the way I began to find joy in my own company. I had begun to make my own choices, to do things because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. I had started taking painting classes. It had always been something I'd enjoyed when I was younger, but I had let it slip away, pushed aside by the demands of family and life. Now, with time on my hands, I was reclaiming it. It felt liberating to pick up a brush again, to lose myself in the colors and the strokes. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something just for me. There were also days when I would visit the local park, sit on a bench, and watch the people around me. I saw families, couples walking hand in hand, children playing. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel bitter or resentful. I just watched them, feeling oddly at peace with my own solitude. The ache in my chest had dulled, and I realized that maybe this was the life I was meant to live now. I didn't need to be part of their world to be happy. My happiness could be found elsewhere, in things that had always been mine, waiting for me to rediscover them. Slowly, I started to build a new routine. I spent more time gardening, something I had always loved but never had time for. The garden had become a place of solace for me. I planted flowers, vegetables, and herbs, watching them grow and bloom under my care. It was a reminder that even after the harshest winters, something beautiful could still bloom. I had begun to see my life in a new way, as a garden. Some parts of it had withered, some had been neglected, but there was always room for new growth. And I was learning how to tend to that growth, how to nurture myself in ways I had never done before. One afternoon, I received a call from Ruth, my sister. We hadn't spoken much since everything had happened, and I was surprised to hear from her. "Helen," she said gently, "I've been thinking a lot about you lately. I know things haven't been easy, and I just wanted to say I'm here for you." I felt a lump form in my throat as I listened to her words. Ruth had always been there for me, even when the rest of the family had distanced themselves. We talked for a while, catching up on everything, and it was a relief to hear her voice. It felt like a small piece of my old life had returned, and for the first time in a while I didn't feel so alone. It wasn't a cure for everything that had happened, but it was a reminder that not all family had turned their backs on me. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a while, reflecting on what Ruth had said. It had been a simple gesture, just a call to check in, but it meant more to me than she probably realized. I hadn't realized how much I needed that connection, how much I needed to hear from someone who truly cared. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a reminder that not all bonds are broken, and sometimes, there are still pieces of the past that are worth holding on to. But as I reflected on it, I realized that I had to stop waiting for my family to come back. I had spent too much time looking for their approval, waiting for them to acknowledge the hurt they had caused. I couldn't keep living like that. My happiness couldn't depend on their actions. I had to create my own happiness from the inside out. I spent the next few weeks focusing more on the things that brought me joy. I joined a book club at the local library and began reading again. something I had neglected for far too long. I found comfort in the pages of novels, in the escape they offered, and in the conversations with the people in the club. Slowly I was beginning to feel whole again. There were still hard days, still moments when the loneliness crept in, but I knew that I was getting stronger. The pain of the past wasn't gone, but it was becoming easier to live with. I was learning to move forward one day at a time, and I knew that eventually, I would be able to look back at this chapter in my life with a sense of peace. The family I had once known was no longer the same, but that didn't mean I had to stay stuck in the past. I was moving forward and I was doing it on my own terms. I had found my way back to myself. I had been moving forward piece by piece, embracing the new life I was starting to carve out for myself. But there was still a part of me that couldn't quite shake the weight of everything that had happened. The loneliness wasn't as heavy as it had been, but it was still there, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. I found myself on some evenings staring out at the sunset, lost in thought. I wasn't sure where I was going or what I was supposed to do next, but I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't afford to look back anymore. The days had begun to feel less like a struggle and more like an opportunity. Every morning felt like a new start. I made my way through the day, creating little moments of joy that were entirely mine. I learned to take walks without rushing, without thinking about the past. I joined a group at the local senior center for dance classes, something I would have never considered before, but it felt freeing to do something just for myself. It was funny how the smallest things could make such a big difference. Yet, even as I built this new life, there were times when the weight of what had been lost seemed to creep back in. The holidays were the hardest. I had grown accustomed to having my family around during those times, and now the empty spaces at the dinner table felt like a constant reminder of how things had changed. I kept telling myself that it didn't matter, that I had moved on, but there were moments when I wished things were different. One afternoon, as I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea, my phone rang. It was Ruth, my sister. She was calling to check in just like she had done in the past. But this time there was something in her voice that made me stop what I was doing and listen. "Helen," she said softly, "I've been thinking a lot about you, and I think it's time we talked. About everything." I didn't know what to expect, but I knew Ruth well enough to know that when she said something like that, it was important. I agreed to meet her at a cafe the next day. I wasn't sure what to expect, but part of me felt like maybe it was time to face the past, to address the things that had been left unsaid. The next day, I sat across from Ruth in a small, quiet cafe. We ordered coffee and pastries, and for a few minutes the conversation was light. We talked about the weather, about how the town had changed over the years. But eventually Ruth got quiet, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Helen," she started, "I know you've been through a lot. I know how much you've been hurt by everything that happened with the family. But I think it's time you know the truth. I think you need to hear it from someone who was there." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever Ruth was about to say. She took a deep breath before continuing. "When everything fell apart, when your son and daughter-in-law started pulling away, it wasn't just you. It wasn't just them. There were things that happened behind the scenes that you never knew about. And I think it's time you understood the whole picture." I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. Part of me was terrified to hear what she was going to say. Part of me didn't want to know. But another part of me knew that this was a conversation I needed to have. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ruth looked down for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "Helen, I don't know if you've noticed, but your son has been changing for a while. Ever since his wife came into the picture, things were different. He wasn't the same person. And I think she knew exactly what she was doing. I think she wanted to take him away from you." My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure what to say. Ruth continued, "I'm not blaming her entirely, but she pushed him away from you little by little. She made him believe that you were too much of a burden, that you were holding him back. And I think that's why they started distancing themselves. It wasn't just life getting in the way. It was something deeper, something that was being manipulated." I sat in silence for a long time, letting Ruth's words sink in. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Betrayal? Or was it just sadness? It felt like everything I had believed about my family was falling apart. "But why didn't you say anything?" I finally asked. Ruth sighed deeply. "I didn't know how. I didn't want to make things worse. I thought maybe if I said something it would only push him further away from you. But now I think you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand what happened, even if it hurts. I felt a tear slip down my cheek. It was hard to process everything. It was one thing to feel abandoned. It was another to know that the abandonment had been carefully planned. But as much as the truth hurt, I realized that this was the closure I had been searching for. The pain of it didn't go away, but at least now I knew why it had happened. And maybe, just maybe, that would help me move forward even further. I didn't say much after that. I just sat with Ruth drinking my coffee, letting the silence speak for itself. When I left the cafe, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't a happy feeling, but it was a real one. And in some strange way it was exactly what I needed to hear. I walked back to my car, my mind racing with thoughts of everything Ruth had told me. The truth was finally out and it had changed everything. I didn't know where I was going from here, but I knew I couldn't go back to the way things had been. It was time to move forward for real this time. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. The rest of my life was still waiting to be written. I spent the next few days and a days trying to digest everything Ruth had said. Her words echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a broken record. It wasn't just the abandonment. It was the fact that it had been planned, that my own son had been manipulated into turning away from me. I kept asking myself, how could this happen? How could the family I had loved, the family I had given everything to, just walk away? I didn't know the answer, but I couldn't let it define me anymore. I had learned the hard way that sometimes the people you love the most can hurt you the deepest. But I had also learned something else. I wasn't powerless. I still had control over my own life. I wasn't going to let their choices dictate my future. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for apologies that would never come. I needed to focus on myself, on rebuilding what had been broken. I had been doing that slowly but surely over the past few months. I had found a new sense of purpose, a new direction. The loneliness still crept in, but it wasn't as heavy as before. I started making new connections, meeting people who truly cared. And I realized that not all family was bound by blood. One afternoon, I went for a walk in the park, as I had done many times before. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over everything. As I walked, I spotted a bench by the lake and decided to sit for a while. The gentle breeze and the sound of the water calmed my restless mind. It was moments like this that made me realize how far I had come. A few months ago, I wouldn't have even considered taking time to enjoy the simple things in life. I had been so consumed by my grief, by the pain of losing my family, that I had forgotten what peace felt like. Now I was starting to rediscover it. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I was no longer the woman I had been. I wasn't the person waiting for a call or an invitation from my family. I was someone who had learned to find joy in the small moments, someone who had learned to live for herself. And that felt good. As I sat there, I thought back to the day I had decided to go on that trip to the coast. It had felt like such a small thing at the time, but looking back it had been the turning point. That trip had given me the courage to take the next step, to start living again instead of just existing. I had spent so many years giving without ever asking for anything in return. But now I was learning to take time for myself, to take care of myself, to put my needs first. And it wasn't selfish. It was necessary. The pain was still there, of course. I didn't think it would ever go away completely. But it was no longer consuming me. It was just a part of my past now, a part of my story that I had to accept. And as hard as it was, I was starting to see that acceptance as a form of freedom. I had finally let go of the need for approval, for validation from my family. I didn't need them to validate my worth. I was enough just as I was. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. I had come a long way. I had faced my pain, I had embraced it. And I was learning to live with it. And in doing so, I was finally learning to live for myself. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the air grew cooler, but I didn't want to leave the park. I didn't want to leave this moment of peace, this moment of clarity. But eventually I stood up, took a deep breath and began walking back to my car. As I drove home that evening, I felt a sense of calm that had eluded me for so long. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I didn't need the answers to everything. I didn't need my family to return to me. I had everything I needed right here within me. The next day, I decided to visit Ruth again. I had something I needed to say. I wanted to thank her for telling me the truth, for helping me see things clearly. But I also wanted to tell her that I was okay, that I was stronger now, that I had found a way to heal, and that I was moving forward. I didn't need her to fix everything, but I wanted her to know that I was finally starting to fix myself. When I arrived at her house, I found her sitting in the garden as she always did. She looked up when I approached, and I could see the worry in her eyes. But I smiled, and I knew then that it wasn't just for her that I was smiling. It was for me. I sat down beside her and we talked. I told her about my journey, about the steps I had taken to rebuild my life. And when I was done, Ruth reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Helen," she said softly. And in that moment I realized that the pride I had always sought from my family I had found in myself. It was all I needed. It was all I would ever need. And as I sat there with Ruth, I felt a sense of peace that I had been searching for all along. The past would always be there, but I was no longer held captive by it. I was free. And that freedom, that peace was mine to keep. I woke up the next morning with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog that had clouded my mind seemed to lift, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control of my own life. The past few weeks had been a journey of rediscovery. I had learned to find joy in the little things, to take care of myself, and to accept that my family wasn't going to be the source of my happiness anymore. But as much as I had moved forward, there were still moments when the weight of what had happened would come crashing down on me. I spent the morning in the garden, the sun warming my skin as I tended to the flowers. Gardening had become a form of therapy for me. Each plant I cared for felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming my peace. But as I trimmed the roses, I found my thoughts drifting back to the conversation with Ruth. She had given me the truth I needed, but it wasn't an easy truth to accept. My son had been manipulated, yes, but he still had made the choice to walk away. And that was something I had to come to terms with. I couldn't change it. I couldn't make him see what he had lost. But I had lost something too. I had lost the illusion of family, the dream that we would always be there for each other, no matter what. And that was painful. But I couldn't let that pain define me anymore. I wasn't going to let it hold me back. I wasn't going to let it stop me from living my life. The afternoon passed quietly, and I found myself sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. The world felt still, yet full of possibilities. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone. I wasn't waiting for my son to come back. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I was simply living. And that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, I began to embrace the idea of living without the expectation that my family would ever return to me. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to something that was slipping away, and now I was learning to let go. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had faded into something else, a quiet acceptance. I accepted that the family I had known was gone, but that didn't mean I had to be defined by it. I still had a future that was mine to create. I started taking weekend trips to explore new places. I visited small towns I had never been to before, walked through their streets, and marveled at the beauty of the world I had been too busy to notice. It was liberating, this new life I was building for myself. One of the towns I visited had a small, charming bookstore. I spent hours there, lost in the pages of a novel, the smell of old books filling the air. I had forgotten how much I loved to read. It was one of those simple joys that had been buried under the weight of family obligations. But now it was something I was reclaiming. I found a quiet corner in the bookstore and began reading a book I had picked out on a whim. It was a story of a woman who had been betrayed, much like me, and had to find her way back to herself. As I read, I felt a strange sense of kinship with the character. Her journey mirrored my own in many ways. I finished the book that afternoon, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't expected. It was like the book had given me the permission I needed to move forward. The story wasn't about a perfect ending, but about finding strength in the face of hardship. And that was something I was starting to understand. It wasn't about waiting for everything to be fixed. It was about learning to live with the broken pieces and still finding beauty in the cracks. As the months passed, I found myself surrounded by new people. People who genuinely cared about me, who saw me. for who I was, not just as someone's mother or grandmother. See it from a new perspective. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. I couldn't keep living for them. I couldn't keep waiting for apologies that would never come. I had to accept that, no matter how much I wished for things to be different, the family I had known was gone. What remained was the woman I had become, the woman who had learned to stand on her own, to find strength in the face of adversity. That woman was stronger than I had ever realized. I was no longer the person who waited for someone else to fix things. I had learned to fix things for myself. I had learned that I didn't need to be validated by anyone else to feel worthy. I had worth just as I was. One day, as I walked through the park, I found myself smiling at the simple joy of the moment. The birds were singing, the sun was shining, and for the first time in a long while I felt at peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad anymore. I was simply content. The journey had been long, and it had been difficult, but I had made it through. And I had learned so much along the way. I had learned to let go of the things that weighed me down. I had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life, and trust that I could handle whatever came my way. There was a time when I would have never believed that I could find peace after everything I had been through. But now I knew that peace wasn't something that just happened. It was something I had to create for myself. And I had done that. I was building the life I wanted. The life that was no longer defined by the mistakes of others or the pain of the past. I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I had saved myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself. I went home that evening feeling a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in years. I had found a way to be happy on my own terms. The loneliness still crept in sometimes, but it no longer consumed me. I knew that I was enough just as I was. I didn't need anyone else to complete me. I was whole. I sat by the window watching the world outside. The sky was a soft shade of pink, the air still and quiet. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was ready to face whatever came next. And as the days went by, I continued to grow, continued to learn, and continued to build a life that was all my own. The family I had once known may have been gone, but I had found something much more valuable. I had found myself. And that was enough.